Hi, my name's Zarina. Welcome to Beyond Return livecast. Beyond Return is a collective working towards new possibilities for different forms of economic and social logic.
Hey, I'm Eric. I am working on Beyond Return as well, on the viability team. And in my understanding, Beyond Return is a support apparatus for supporting organizations and institutions and individuals who are basically working to produce post-capitalist futures.
Hi, I'm Anouk. I am working on digital commons within Beyond Return and outside of it. And I think Beyond Return is a kind of connection of various movements that have kind of grown in strength since the pandemic and been better connected with the purpose of, for me specifically, I think the most important part of Beyond Return is to create economic systems and social systems that really work for the most, or if not all humans, rather than for a small subset of humans.
Nice. Yeah. I'm Clement. I'm kind of studying and just learning lots of stuff right now. Every time I try to place myself in a box, that box disappears. So I don't know.
Okay, so we are going to have a small and informal conversation about one of our strategies that we're investigating as a collective. For many of us, this is not just theory, but praxis. Many of us are actually engaged in these practices. And we're going to talk about commons, the commons, commoning, and what it is to be a commoner. So does anyone feel up to talking about just a basic definition of what commons is and how they differ from public goods and other kinds of goods?
Yeah, I can start with the definition of the common good, and then maybe from there someone else can take it into what it means to manage those goods, which is kind of a slightly different thing. So if we just look at various types of good, usually we make a distinction between things that are excludable versus non-excludable, and that means you can exclude someone from using that good with relative ease, or you cannot. So for instance, it's pretty easy to exclude someone from using my house, but it's actually really hard to exclude someone from using air. So that's one distinction. And then the other one is whether the good is rivalrous or non-rivalrous. And that basically means that there are goods for which it's true that if I consume them, you can no longer consume them. And there's goods for which that's not true. Again, air is kind of the one it's really hard to exclude people from using it. Not impossible, but hard. And if I breathe air, you can still also breathe air. But there are also others where it's hard to exclude people from them. But also, if I use it, then it's harder for you to use it. For instance, if you have a river, it's hard to exclude people from using the river. I mean, you can build really tall fences around rivers, but let's say we don't want to do that. Then it's actually quite hard to exclude people from using the river. But if we all use the river, like if someone starts polluting in the river, then I cannot no longer use it for fun swimming and other activities or fishing. So that's what we usually refer to as a common good. And it's really hard to exclude someone, but if I use it, you can use less of it. And so we have to work together to figure out how much I can use of it so that you can also still make use of it. Which brings us to how you manage such goods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that the sort of definitions of these things, which I think is known as property rights, are a little bit more fluid than just categories. They're the rules of engagement with these things. So I think it's important to say that, like, something can be sort of a commons in a certain time, and then not a commons in another time, and it sort of depends how you use it. It's also important that, like, something that feels abundant, that like air, is sort of considered a public good, but the moment it's under threat and it is sort of becomes a scarce good, that relationship changes because our relationship to that resource changes, and we start to change the contract with which we're allowed to engage. So these things are inherently sort of social dynamics as opposed to sort of categories of objects, which I think is something I've only sort of picked up on more recently. And so inherently the way we treat a resource and the way we use it and deplete it changes all the other relationships to all the other resources we have. And so these are sort of like quite dynamic systems. Does that sound about right to everyone else?
Yeah.
I think, I would look at it more as our laws and our technologies change whether a good is rivalrous and excludable. So let's say the technology of a fence all of a sudden allows you to exclude people from a river, whereas before that just wasn't true. And similarly, different legal systems can turn things into private property versus collectively owned property. Like if those rights are protected, then that changes how you can relate to a thing. So I think that's more or less your point. I think it still sort of falls within the frame of how far can you exclude someone from using the thing, and in how far is it rivalrous.
Great.
A big reason of like why all this is really interesting and like kind of build off from that is that when you pay attention to how people typically end up managing commons and start treating commons and have done throughout history, it really puts into question the like current economic intuition people have that they apply to the way goods and services are distributed currently. So like a lot of the like economic theory, which is used to justify a lot of the policy around economy, and also is kind of what most people have in their heads when they interact with the economy, assumes all sorts of things about human nature and how people interact that just turn out not to be true when you pay attention to how people have looked at and treated the commons. So I think a really interesting part of the commons is actually kind of the paradigm or discourse around it that's been generated by people who have like paid attention to how people have treated the commons and like just ways to go about that throughout history. So I think it might also be interesting to kind of explore the like what it tells us about like capitalism, what it tells us about the economy, which kind of can uproot and start making us think past a lot of the like I would say quite like trapped and wrong intuitions and ideas we have of people being self-interested fundamentally and acting in accordance with like certain like rational principles, which I think will be interesting too.
Great. Okay. Does anyone feel that they can speak to commoning as a verb, as a sort of more modern take of commons, is that it is a practice? Does anyone want to speak on that?
Yeah, sure. I think a big idea with that kind of like the paradigm shift idea of like, we need to think about the way we relate to our goods and services and the economy in a different way. Also means like there's like an impetus to start like building a new world in which commons and just relation to the commons become practice, like kind of within the current one that doesn't treat them the right kind of way. And that means that there's all sorts of practices you can apply to like pretty much every area of life, every business you're in, every profession you might be in, every kind of community or home situation you're in, that try to bring like a better way of thinking about how we can go about sharing and using common resources, and like implementing that in the existing world. That's what common is. Those practices so kind of build a radically different machine. Constraints is the one that we're trying to.
Clem, I think we're losing your audio a little bit. It's just quite quiet. Oh, there we go. Yeah, that's great.
Cool. It's to computer.
Great. Yeah, I think so. I really like this idea of commoning as a verb. I think the commons as a sort of like as an object or a sort of set of resources is nothing without the commoners. And the commoners are the people who maintain it, who look after it, who steward it, who live in it and off it. And so that's us. And I think this is a really sort of wonderful framing because I think of the commons in many ways as a transfer culture, as a sort of creating the new world in the shell of the old, if you will, and commoning as the sort of like set of practices and ideas, the sort of like ways of governance, the like decision making that we all use whilst we're operating in the commons, so that we have the skills, we have the tools for sort of different economic logic futures. Great. All right. Anyone else want to talk about being a commoner before we move on to governing and protecting the commons?
At some point, I want to talk about the relationship between commons and capitalism, which is really important to draw out.
Great.
Yeah. So I think, if you'll remember the last time we had a recession, there was a whole lot of excitement about this sharing economy idea. And it was in that last recession that people really, It was in the last recession that people really got excited about the idea of having different types of economy in place for people to get their needs met, precisely because the capitalist market was in such a rut. But what you found was by the year 2015, people were already declaring that the sharing economy was dead, precisely because people basically didn't care enough to keep it alive. The problem with that assessment was that it was only being drawn out in cities which had recovered, whereas huge proportions of the geography of the United States, for example, had not recovered from the recession. So to declare the sharing economy dead before even having implemented it in some of these more economically affected and impacted places was totally jumping the gun. So I think what we need is a series of tools, especially now that we're back in a recession. We need a series of tools that actually help us switch from one type of economy to another. And a commons-based economy should be one of those types of economy. And these tools should be ones that can work either in a market or in a non-market situation. The reason being that in a recession, what you basically have is this insane situation where you have all these people and all these resources sitting idle right next to each other, and you just can't get them connected. So now we have this crazy situation where huge parts of the world are facing what's being called biblical famine conditions. This is right now with this locust swarm, with the COVID-19 crisis, both of those things sort of compounding each other. And at the same time, you have farmers in the United States, industrial farmers, pouring out massive amounts of milk, tilling vegetables back into the soil, throwing out sinking crops to the bottom of the ocean, basically just destroying all this abundance because there's no market for that food. And so I think we really need to think about new ways of connecting people with resources. And I think this is where like ideas around like human-centered recoveries are super important and super interesting. And actually, it's probably best to frame it not just as human-centered, but indeed sort of planet-centered or life-centered recoveries, because there are other species we have to worry about. And this fundamentally would be a commons-based approach. And it's important, too, to distinguish between a commons approach and a sort of more traditional Keynesian quasi-socialist approach, which like much of the left has sort of been advocating for since like the New Deal, which was the American policy that got us out of, or supposedly got us out of the Great Depression, which basically redistributes wealth that's created and accumulated within capitalism. A commons-based approach does not need that capitalist economic engine to redistribute that value from. If you do need that capitalist economy running strongly, constantly, in order to fuel your recovery, your social programs, and so forth, your environmental programs, there's always going to be the downside of massive environmental destruction, massive social costs, and also just the fact that capitalism is super faulty, as we know, and it falls apart at times. And crises are becoming deeper and more frequent. So you don't want to have that kind of a flawed engine to like build all of your sort of like socialist policies and economies on. So commons are very different from that. Those suggest a sort of peer-to-peer economic abundance where people participating strengthens and bolsters the ability of that economy to provide. And it means people getting their needs fundamentally met outside of the market. But here, capitalism is still liable to come and interfere in our endeavors and to exploit the commons that we create. Indeed, this is the basis of capitalism. Capitalism does not work without non-capitalist economies existing in a relation of subservience to it. This is something that Rosa Luxemburg pointed out in The Accumulation of Capital over 100 years ago now, that capitalism is fundamentally dependent on non-capitalist economies to make up for its deficiencies in producing its own buying power. So capitalism is rooted in this concept that's called primitive accumulation, an old Marxist term, which is basically the act of enclosure. So you enclose commons and turn them into private property. You drive people off the land so they can't subsist off of it into cities, or they are now dependent on markets. So there's been this long, drawn-out trans-historical process that has kept capitalism afloat, which is specifically exploiting existing non-capitalist commons. And this is something that also Marxist feminists have pointed out, I think, really strongly, made a very strong case for, that this happens even in developed nations where you rely on basically domestic labor, which is a free source of value creation, which then flows back into the capitalist system through the worker who's sustained by that domestic labor. So it's an ongoing process. And so what we need are like ways to guard against our commons being exploited in this trans-historical way endlessly. And this is something that the Italian autonomia movement really explored in I think quite a fruitful way with their concept of destructuration. And destructuration specifically denotes a political strategy that attempts to avoid our commons being exploited by capital endlessly. It wasn't enough to just self-valorize, which is their term for getting your needs met outside the market. You also needed to make sure that the value that you're creating collectively didn't always just support that market that continued to exploit you, whether through political or sort of outside economic means.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the challenge of our time. So I went to
one point worth jumping.
Yeah, go for it.
In on that before we move on, which is just like this core idea that capitalism requires the exploitation of existing commons to operate. Like, one thing worth thinking about there is, where do those commons come from? Like, before capitalism came about, those commons like did in different ways like form like the basis of like many economies. Like, for example, in the Byzantine Empire, like in the Islamic world, and like you see similar things happening in China and in like medieval Europe, and like definitely similar things in things that became colonies later, right? Like, you kind of have natural common resources there, and they kind of still keep spontaneously generating even within a capitalist system. But then the capitalist system has adapted to like just constantly exploiting anything that spontaneously comes up. And by paying attention to that like relatively abundant generation of commons and trying to think of a different way for those to like relate to each other and structure on a greater level, like it kind of frees us from thinking that the capitalist engine is what's making this possible in the first place. It's not. It's the commons that the capitalist engine is exploiting, of making. We think of a different way to like relate to each other and to have commons relate to each other that is simply less exploitative and more harmonious in its conception.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is why, this sort of reminds me of the like tolerance intolerance paradox in a way, which people often ask, why can't we, we don't have to abolish capitalism. Maybe we can just have capitalism and some other things. And I think what people fail to realize is that capitalism needs to keep drawing from other kinds of economic logic. And so it just eats them all up. It is a sort of like terrible parasite in a way. And we have like propped up this sort of, treated the symptoms of this parasite for a long time. And I'm not saying that there isn't good elements to capitalism, but I think this like question of how do you maintain, I think, what we probably might refer to as an ethical membrane between these different kind of pockets of economic logic so that we can have diverse economies. I think one of the things that we've really seen as a destructive force in this pandemic is that we don't have a range of adaptable economies. We only really have this sort of one that needs to be needs to grow endlessly, and if it doesn't grow, it collapses. Right, our economy is just completely fallen apart because we just needed it to pause for a second, and it just couldn't do that. But if you look at the other economies that are like not currently valued, like the care economy, like solidarity economies, these are all thriving. People are looking after each other, sort of coordinating ways to make sure people get food, making sure that there's resources around. So those economies exist already and are working and are not harmed by having to pause or adapt. So I think this idea of creating ethical membranes between different economic systems is a really key one. And I know Michelle Bowens talks about some of these sort of approaches. So they have this, they point to examples where people who are in the commons or using commons resources or participating in the commons get to do so for free. But if you are taking or making money from the commons to sort of like for personal profit or for exchange, you are subject to a large fee. So that way you can maintain different kinds of users and different kinds of economic logics, but there's a sort of membrane between the two of you that stops one from eating the other. And I think that's really like fundamental. I think it also points to this other fact, which is that we, as individuals, you are only a commoner when you're in the commons, and we all go outside of our commons into the sort of default world every day, into our jobs. And for most people, they are playing a different role with a different economic social relation in different places. And I think it's really important to remember that there isn't some arbitrary line between the commoners and the not commoners. We are all playing different roles in different ways when we're interacting with our families, or in commonwealth production, or in capital wealth production, or as labourers. We're all sort of like doing different things. Does anyone have any thoughts on like what those ethical membranes might be, or like ideas that you've seen play out? I know, Anouk, you're working on this stuff in terms of data.
Right. Yeah, so I think both data, but even because data complicates everything. So looking just at land, I think things like community land trusts are a really clever way to say, look, you can still make some money in some part, but then there's another part that we have determined to be a common good that we're going to manage as a commons. And I will explain in a second what it actually is. But basically what it does is give a legal protection to the thing to basically underlying asset that you are commonly managing, so that it cannot just be taken away by someone else coming in and understanding its value, which is usually what happens, right? It's a bit like colonialization, where the people living on the land didn't value the land in a capitalist sense. They weren't selling the land, and therefore not holding property rights to it. And someone else comes in and is like, hey, actually, if we divide this and give other people rights to it, we can make a lot of money. And so that's sort of the cycle. And a community land trust kind of breaks that by saying, we're putting the land in this community in a trust, and the trust can make decisions about that land. Usually upon the creation of the land trust, it's decided what the rent should be for living on that land. And that's a decision based on what people can pay or what we want them to pay, but it's not necessarily a decision based on whatever someone wants to pay, right? So there's already a difference there. And then you can still, and I think that's kind of interesting, you can still move in and out. So what would happen is, if you want to own a house in a community that is part of a community land trust, you would be able to buy the house, but then you pay rent to the land trust for the underlying land. And so, because actually what determines a lot of our housing prices is not so much the building, it's the land it sits on. So this would keep that affordable, while you still can move in and out and sell like the asset that you're working on. So it has a kind of beautiful way of combining some of the good things about a market with some of the protections and kind of this sense of community, actually. I mean, it's literally a community land trust built into the legal structure. And I think we need legal protections like that for a lot more than just land. And we could create them. I think trusts, and yeah, I'm working on data trusts, which do basically a similar thing, but instead of putting land in a trust, we put data in a trust. And I feel like we can do that for a lot more assets, especially in countries that actually have these legal tools. Yeah.
Nice.
I do believe that a larger scale of the community land trust idea of land being the underlying land being handled in a different way it's called Georgism.
Georgism.
Yeah, I think the fundamental idea there is that the land is publicly owned, but the structures on top can be privately owned, and it distinct.
Oh yeah, I see it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh wow, so the opposite of England, where the Queen owns the land, and we all rent it for like extraordinary prices.
I think the English model is theoretically Georgian, but
is that right?
Yeah. So basically, if the Queen weren't a queen, so that's maybe a fundamental difference that I skipped over. The community land trust is governed, like the people on the boards are the people living in the houses. The people are part of the larger community. So like anyone who runs a business in the area or is generally considered part of that community can have a vote. And then there's a voting board for anyone with kind of a, let's say, political or expert interest. So that's like the third board is lawyers and politicians. But yeah, so basically it's community run. So instead of the Queen deciding what the price should be, it's everyone deciding what the price should be.
Yeah.
The idea that the Queen is an invisible hand deciding.
I doubt she decides it on her own, but yeah.
Right. I mean, I think this points to an interesting thread, which is that oftentimes when we look at sort of alternative solutions to our current structural problems, they often involve having more people involved. So whether that's like worker-owned co-ops or people-owned means of production, or sort of more democratic processes. And I think in this example, it's that that more people, and ideally all people, right? Because I think that the problem you might end up with is that you could have competing commons. Like just having many commons isn't the solution. It's just a sort of seed form of a different kind of world. But you could imagine that we ended up with two global commons that were in competition with each other that might be a sort of like new form of nation states that still like war and so on and so forth. What you really want is everybody owning everything, or at least making sure that everyone is incentivized for everyone else to win.
I kind of want to dig a bit more into that. Like, I feel like a lot of what's interesting about the commons is that, like, the idea that everyone owns everything kind of means that no one owns anything. Like, the whole concept of ownership. Well, it's actually interesting to think about what ownership actually is. Like, it's a concept that came about in Roman law, and it was initially all law was simply about and governing relationships between people, and it was only when there was certain concepts which were applied to, like, the way that a person would like relate to a literal slave, that the concept of ownership even came about in the first place. And then that concept was later abstracted to the ownership of other things. So the idea that we want to have this concept of ownership proliferate to literally everything is, like, I guess, a way of like undermining the concept of ownership in the first place. But I think a lot of what's interesting about the commons is like transmuting this idea of ownership, which is something that I think in the case of private property and private ownership leads to a very exclusionary and a very community notion. And it co-opts that and turns it into something that builds communities. So I think something that's very valuable about the commons is precisely the fact that you have a community which own a set of things collectively. If it's like a cooperative or some land or some water or something more difficult, like more complicated than that. And like the concept of ownership is the kind of exactly the like weird membranes that you were talking about before, where the membrane between a community and its and the outside world, this kind of porous membrane, is this concept of ownership, where sure other people can use it, but when other people use it, they're using it on the terms of the community which own and govern the thing.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Like, you cannot. I'm not sure you can have a protected commons without underlying property rights. I think ownership needs a little bit more explanation because, to your point of people owning things, and this is going to get a little technical, but in common law, it's not so much that people own things. It's more that the ownership or the property rights more describe the relations we have with each other.
Yeah.
So I have a right to use this thing, and you do not have a right to use it. That's a relationship between the two of us rather than a relationship between us and a thing.
Yeah.
This is very different in civil law, where you outright own something, and the whole sharing and people having different types of property rights is a lot more complicated in that part of the world. But in at least in the common law part of the world, which is the US, England, Canada, this notion that you can have that different types of property rights is really interesting. And so those rights usually are the right to access something, the right to use something, and the right to alienate your rights. And that's where ownership comes in. So only once you have a right to say, I can sell this thing and thereby kind of my bundle of rights to someone else, are you considered to be an owner of a thing. And I think we can imagine...
Can you explain the inalienable one?
Right. So let's say I live in a house right now. I have the right to access that house. I have the right to make use of the house, but I'm the renter. I have no rights to sell on my rental lease to someone else. So I'm not a full owner of that house. Only if I'm able to sell the house and thereby my rights to use it and my right to access it, am I considered an owner? And I think that's a really important distinction for the commons, because you could easily imagine a group of people having maybe not even all the same rights, but all having different rights to the same asset without having any rights to alienate their rights, for instance. Or we have subsets of these people who do have a right to alienate a right, but maybe not for a profit. Like, there's all sorts of things we can do with property rights that don't even touch on ownership yet.
Right. And I think, these are some of the things that are really interesting to explore. So I know in the community where I'm at, we've tried to adopt some of these different... we lost Clem.
We lost Clem. He just...
access, different access rights. So, like, are you someone who gets to decide who else gets access to this thing? Are you someone who... just gets to make decisions about the resources within this thing, or are you someone who just gets to participate and move through this thing? And so there's like different levels of user agreements, which are really nice, because they actually allow you to create user agreements that reflect the relationships that are there, and to sort of to lean into high trust relationships. And sort of steward in new relationships. So I think that's really wonderful, and I wish this sort of language is a bit more sort of commonplace, because we tend to just use very crude proxies like ownership, and sort of like other sort of common legal structures to define our relationship to things. And I think this seeps into our sort of ideas of what's possible, and we sort of fail to think that we could have a different world. And I think sci-fi is the only thing that sort of speaks to this. I think in Ursula Le Guin's Dispossessed, when they have a completely different sense of like ownership or lack thereof, when ownership wasn't a thing. You didn't get to own an object, you just got to use it. And I think their quote is, "Nothing is yours, everything is shared. If you cannot share it, you cannot use it," something like that. And that's like really fascinating to think about. Like, say for example, you could only like own a very few items, in that you were only able to have a few things that you could ask nobody else to use. That would change your relationship to common goods in such an extraordinary way. And we just sort of don't have a good embodied sense of what that's like. And for me, that's what being a commoner is about, discovering. Like, how does it feel to operate in a different logic? How are you changed? How is your psychology changed? How does your sort of like ideas about humanity and how humans operate change when you're operating in new sort of programs?
For sure.
The other thing I wanted to mention is that I don't know if any of you have read any Daniel Schmachtenberger. I don't know how you say their name, but they have a really great. When I think they were on a podcast with Eric Weinstein recently, and Eric sort of asked them, how do you think this is all going to come about? Like having gotten to the place where they had some common ground about what a post-capitalist world might look like. Eric said, how do you think we're going to get to this place? And Daniel was just sort of like, we need to become different kinds of humans. We need to become humans for whom the prisoner's dilemma just doesn't make sense anymore. Where these are sort of like old sort of like behavioral games that just don't work in our new sort of society or in our current psychology. And I think that's totally right. We have to reconfigure ourselves from creatures recognizing that we were raised in scarcity and in competition. We have to sort of reconfigure ourselves as commoners for whom we want to contribute to commonwealth and look after our commons. And I think once we've done that, the rest will be fairly easy. No, Clem?
On that last point, I think that I really think that is like an important part of it. Like you have to like want to undergo some kind of transformation, and I think it's also like quite a hopeful part in the sense that there's many people, like myself included, but I think there's many people for whom that kind of transformation could be an incredibly like important and like amazing personal thing to get involved with something like this, because I think it can like help us combat on like a psychological level a lot of the alienation and like kind of emotional abuse that we've suffered from capitalism in our lifetime. But I do think that it's important to note that like it's not just that we have to change ourselves. Like we also a huge amount of it is that there's like capitalism ultimately is a enormous power structure which has kind of found itself onto the existing system, and that it kind of needs to be resisted to an extent. And I think common ownership actually comes in on that level as well. Like when you're talking about the alienability that like private property and ownership currently entails, a lot of what that means is that essentially we're put in a position where like just by participating in the legal economic framework in which we're born, like the things that we use are always able to be extracted and put into this larger capitalist economic system. And ultimately that leads to the accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few people who have like an extraordinary greater access to resources than others. And ultimately capitalism succeeds in finding ways to extract from like the ownership of like the kind of the things that most people are using. And I think a lot of what like commoning and like related concepts like solidarity and so on like really need to have like core is this concept that there actually is a power structure there which needs to be resisted. And a lot of what it means to like build something in which common ownership is or like an idea of the commons is at the center of it, is like a resistance to a system which wants to have you be a wage slave for most of your time, wants your only way of seeking enjoyment be through consuming alienated goods, wants you to like participate in an economy which is ultimately like very damaging for the planet, for our psychologies, and especially for like the many vulnerable people in our communities and around the world.
Yeah, I totally agree. I definitely didn't mean to minimize the structural power that dominant systems have. Yeah, absolutely agree.
To take the historical view, it's important to remember that capitalism like wasn't really a thing until quite recently. Even if capitalist economic relations and capitalist social relations have been around for a really long time, capitalism as a system that is reproduced involves the state. It means you have state apparatuses in place that help that system perpetuate itself. And that's especially necessary with a system like capitalism, which can't sustain itself. It's not an autopoietic system. It's a system that requires a lot of intervention and assistance to maintain itself. For many of the reasons that mean that it has to rely basically on endless growth and endless accumulation of resources and value produced outside of itself. But I do think that there is a pathway for commons-based economies right now, actually. And it's going to involve, I mean, we will need apparatuses of protection, governance structures, protections and so forth. Like, we're definitely going to need apparatuses. We can't just do this willy-nilly and expect this to just emerge on its own without any effort. But I think actually right now is an interesting time to make commons-based demands on the state. And I know that sounds crazy given how hostile the state is to human life and human thriving. But actually, there's a neoliberal case to be made here, which is that basically what is neoliberalism about? It's basically about abdicating your responsibility to the people. And this is, I think, a big part of the reason why we see such an emphasis on resilience discourses. Resilience is largely about telling people to go fend for themselves and to figure their shit out on their own without state intervention. And we started to really see this, especially in the United States, around Hurricane Katrina and the federal emergency response system or management system or engagement, FEMA. They're total failure. And this crisis is an even better example. I mean, like, states are competing for federal resources in a marketplace. It's insane. Anyway, under those circumstances, it's actually better from the state's perspective to have people taking care of themselves within commons-based economies. And I've been wondering a lot lately whether there might be a top-down case to be made to elites as well for pitching them to put pressure on the state to create commons-based economies. And here's why. Right now, we're in this weird situation where tens of millions of people are out of work. And a lot of people are basically suffering economically. It's going to get worse and worse and worse. And if you are an elite right now, that's going to be scary for you, actually. And they're doing everything they can to make sure that doesn't become their problem. And there's two ways that could become their problem. First is that it's expected of them that they basically pay for a socialist welfare state that just like supports people. And who knows how long that'll go on. It might have to go on forever because getting full employment, again, precisely at this weird intersection of like virus, unemployment, capitalist crisis, and automation may never happen. So full employment is another sort of way in which they might be expected to take care of people is actually making space for them in the capitalist economy. So we're in this weird place where like neither socialism or capitalism really has space for people. And elites kind of don't want either of those things. And I think actually now is the time to go to elites and say, oh, you don't want those things? You should probably support people being part of commons-based economies. Yeah, you thought that you hated communism, but actually it turns out is the best thing for you because there are a bunch of people who, in your view, are a total lost cause. And you should help them build the infrastructure they need to not need your support for everyday life and everyday economic survival. So I think there's a strategy to be built there. I could be wrong.
I think we can do one better. We have basically communism for rich people, like things like Burning Man and stuff like that. I think that's because they're equally, they're also suffering from the states not doing anything. And I'm not talking about the billionaires. I'm talking about one level below that.
Sure.
And so, but they're quite like I say them, but basically I'm one of them. We're all quite, we have some power. We have some way to change laws to get things done within a government. And so I think once those groups of people start building commons and realize they need some protection from their very wealthy, annoying commons, they may, and we may start making demands on the state of saying like, because a lot of it is legal protections, just saying, look, we want to make sure that this property is protected or this governance system we've created stays protected. So without even having to go as far as say, well, you should care about these poor people over here, it's probably even true that they should care about themselves in some way. And that's sort of what we're doing with all the trust things, right? Because that's a legal infrastructure that's built for the rich. Like that wasn't built for the poor. That wasn't built for data activists or community land trust activists. It was built for rich people to do different things with their money and basically keep it out of a capitalist system in some ways. And we totally co-opted that, and we can totally co-opt that to do other things with. I feel like maybe there's some other legal structures that we can do the same thing with.
Nice.
Maybe idealistic though.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely we have to find things that are appealing to everyone, and I think these things are appealing to everyone. It's just that we're sort of stuck in this this sort of weird hegemony where we just can't move because everybody's sort of stuck on the past. But yeah, I think yeah, go ahead.
No, you actually gave an example once that I think is quite a powerful one. It's like, all the for-profit community houses and co-living communities. I think was your point. I think you said at some point, like, yeah, we like them because at some point they're going to change the law and make this a lot easier for the rest of us.
Right.
That's, I think, the example.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
I think you have to be a little careful in emphasizing those kinds of examples. Also, like, for instance, I know, kind of starting with what you were saying, Eric, with that kind of being, quote unquote, a neoliberal case for this. I think it's worth really unpicking the ideological component of that, in the sense that a lot of neoliberalism works by having a free market ideology which veils a particularly extractive and authoritative role for a state to essentially allow itself to continue exploiting the poor by like pretending it's in the name of a free market in which the state doesn't have an intervention. I think a really, like, I don't want to go too like genealogical on this, but it's really like interesting to see what the roots of those kind of ideas are in our own intellectual history. And a lot of those ideas come from like the Islamic world, where in like the 11th and 12th century there was essentially a version of the free market in a way that's far closer to the ideology of neoliberalism, in which you had the equivalent of the state, the monopoly on violence at the time, was an entirely separate institution to the kind of merchant classes, which had huge economies. They spanned the entire Indian Ocean from like Africa to Indonesia to like well into Europe. And these economies at the time were like bolstered by like huge networks of trust, which had an idea of a market which is very, very different from our own, in that it's seen as an extension of mutual aid. It's seen as an extension of our common relations to each other. And it was expected that the merchants at the time would build networks of trust by being genuinely good people, moral agents in their systems, which use their position of like responsibility and power to do good for their communities. And that's kind of what was expected of it. And that, I mean, all of this comes down to like simply existing in a very different intellectual tradition. And then those texts were read by Europeans and co-opted for a different kind of ideology, like in like Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and like the kind of entire discipline of economics that came out of that. But the key change that was made, and I think this is a change that you can track down to the difference between Islam and Christianity, as well as some political circles of it at the time, was that it was supposed at that point that these markets, which were theorized in a setting in which, in a mutualistic, in a setting in which would far closer to our conception of the commons here, and it replaced it with an idea of self-interest. That self-interest is only able to operate with an extractive, authoritative state, which allows it to occur. And that's kind of what capitalism consists of. So to suggest it's like a neoliberal case to do this, I think confuses the fact that actually, no, it's like we should really try and break beyond those ideologies and beyond those interest groups. Just say there's a common case to be made for this. And so far, it might be a neoliberal case, or it might be a socialist case, or it might be another case, because a lot of those ideas have this kind of like communist or communist element in the core of it. And also think that it'd be like, it's important to like not say that, hold on, this is not a type of socialism, or this is not like a type of like insert your different alternative to capitalism here. No, it is all of those things. Socialism is another instantiation of an alternative power structure, an alternative economy, which can protect people, which can have like a positive relation with the commons. And if we try too hard to appeal to neoliberals or the rich, who might have a conception of socialism which is different from one in which that comprises the commons, I think we're would be too quick and too easy to put ourselves in a bit of a pigeonhole where we're not able to do something that genuinely appeals to everyone and genuinely can bring about the kind of political change that we wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you that, like, you know, trying to appeal to everybody at the beginning can lead to a sort of what we call the tyranny of the average, which is that, you know, like, you end up with a really neutral thing where no one's really got their needs met, which I think is why. So, you know, what we've been talking about is diverse economies, like multitudes, right? So having flexible, different kinds of economies that serve different purposes and so on and so forth. So I think, you know, I think that's why the commons is very powerful, because you can just go and start them very small, you know, like your family is a little commons. Go ahead.
Oh, I didn't want to interrupt you.
That's
specifically. Okay, no, I think if I understand Eric's point correctly, I think it's not so much appealing to everyone as finding allies for different parts of the road. And like even allies that may have completely conflicting interests in the long run, maybe your ally for like, you know, till the end of the street, and then we'll part ways again and do something else. I think that to me sounds very appealing, because I do think we have some really unlikely allies in some really unlikely places. And we shouldn't count them out just because they say very weird things or things that sound really weird to us.
Absolutely.
Totally. Just finding the alignment of interests, I think,
in
the actual environment. I mean, we are in this environment, the soil of which is 40 years, 30 years of neoliberalism. And seeing, like, really being realistic about where we are with that economic history and political history and intellectual history, as you were touching on there, Clem, and then trying to make the most of it, rather than pretending like we're in another situation. And it feels like so much of our left politics today assume that we're going to be, that somehow we're in this strong economic position in terms of capitalism being healthy and thriving and producing all this excess that we can redistribute. So much of our left politics assume that we can basically go back to the 1950s and has nostalgia for that place, which of course is a racist, exclusionary moment where we are on the top of an empire that is exploiting the rest of the world in an unsustainable and very short-lived way. That's never coming back.
For sure. And it shouldn't. Yeah, no, for sure.
But we don't want it to come back. That's kind of the whole point, right? Like, that's not what we want.
Yeah, so we're seeking a sort of futuristic, perhaps never seen before form of diverse commons and commoning. I think that's right. And I think there's some power there. I think what I often encounter in the world when I'm talking about these things is that people just assume that the options are capitalism or communism or socialism, and with those categories they assume that they are past versions of those.
Right.
You know, and so it's just astounding to me that people are just like, oh well, you know, communism kills loads of people. I'm like, well, it did then. Like, you know, like that was a version of, you know, in a different time and space, you know, so I'm definitely not advocating we go back to any of those. Like, we can definitely do better than anything we've ever tried before. And so, yeah, that seems exciting. Okay, so go ahead.
There's a little tiny bit on, just because I think the position on like communism and socialism that's kind of been said here, I think we have to be a little careful in the sense that actually these ideas have been, like, instantiations of these ideas and conception of these ideas have been very different throughout history, and there's been all sorts of different like arguments about that. I mean, for instance, like Marx wrote a bunch of critiques of the socialists of his time, so like there's all sorts of layers to this. And I do think that we should really think about how socialism in particular is actually very much allied to this particular idea. And I think many people out there do really see like the problem of capitalism and think socialism is the answer. And I think to the most part, if you listen to what they're saying and the aspects of socialism they're drawing attention to, they're very much right. They're very much drawing attention to exactly the kind of thing we're drawing attention to here. And it's very much worth saying that, hold on, like many people who like talk about a kind of socialism don't talk about a callback to era. Even the Green New Deal in its details doesn't really share the position of capitalism in many of its conceptions that the New Deal of that time did as well. So I think it's important to be like, hold on, like in every way of thinking or every kind of position that we're faced with, can we distill what's being said in a language in a way that does actually resonate with what we're trying to do. And in the case of neoliberalism, it's the ideology which is pretending to conceive, when taken in its actual form, when it's built on relationships of mutual aid and of a kind of like a degree of humanity which you just don't see in current implementation, there's something to that. It's just not the way that it's been actually enacted in the world today. And socialism, once again, when the ideas behind it, when you take more seriously the kind of the anti-capitalism that I think should be a strong part of socialism, and you don't associate it with things like the Roosevelt era to the same degree, you once again get something that's actually very much allied with what we're trying to do. But yeah,
I think you're saying the same thing.
Yeah,
for sure. I just think it's like for anyone listening to this, like when we come back to this, to be like how we phrase these things in terms of like movements or intellectual positions or political positions that exist, like very much will bear on how we're able to persuade people and how we're able to have this which transfers to other people's heads.
Totally. So yeah, maybe getting beyond the language, it's worth like distilling down sort of first principles, if you will. I like it when people talk about let's get down to first principles, because then you suddenly are agreeing with libertarians in weird ways that you never thought you could, and like finding common ground with people you never thought you would. So for me, the main point to be made really is that we should not be held hostage by economic growth and economic health in the capitalist economy to build our social projects. That is a losing game. It'll never work again. And so we need to think differently. And I think that's where commons becomes so important, is because that is a totally different economic engine. Not waiting for capitalism to produce the wealth that we redistribute. We can do these things.
I like that positive notion of like saying like, here's this idea that we have, here's what the elements of that, here's what it consists of, right? And then you can try and find those common elements in what other people are saying, rather than rejecting them by name or like define as their own.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone got any last comments on the sort of the deep transformational properties or potential of commons or commoning that we haven't touched on?
I just want to throw out that like we really need to repurpose existing stuff. So we have existing infrastructures all over the place, and the mode in which it was designed and built is like totally obsolete or becoming obsolete rapidly. And so we need to find new ways of deploying those things. So a house can't just be a suburban house anymore. A highway can't just be a highway anymore. There are all these ways in which we have this stuff. I think a lot spatially, by the way. I'm sure there's tons of digital infrastructures that Nuke you could speak to.
Legal
linguistic infrastructures and so forth. And we need to be repurposing things. So finding new purposes for things and new ways to deploy existing resources, I think, is crucial. And you can do that today. Like you can right now turn your apartment into a node that's part of a commune. You don't have to move out of your apartment. You just share your keys with 10 other people in your building, and you've got a commune. And you can start cooking together. So now you're buying in bulk, right? Like it's true. You're still in the system, but you're less in the system, and you're finding new ways to sort of self-valorize in place, like where you are. We can't just wait for like a new utopian city to be built. We're never going to build that. We have to repurpose what we have.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And especially in this moment where, we're watching tons of like businesses go bust. And like, I've been thinking about Airbnb. If Airbnb goes under, I mean, I don't know if it will, but the infrastructure there that we will lose as a species is extraordinary. And the fact that we haven't got a way to transfer ownership of this infrastructure, this sort of global infrastructure for allowing people to share space back to the people so that, so that it can be used for something else, is like mind-boggling. The amount of investment that's gone into creating this thing, and then we just have no way of, the sort of like graveyard end. We should just be like, okay, thank you for building this thing. It doesn't make sense for this thing to keep operating with the logic it does, but the infrastructure you've built is amazing and will continue to serve serve the people of this planet. So I think like thinking about how we get people owned or people led or people stewarded, I should say, infrastructure would be really, really wonderful.
Actually, the commons is like, that's a huge part of what the commons is. It's that repurposing. That's like why the option for the fossil fuel industry is like a thing, because it's the idea that we can, like, one way to start getting out of the climate crisis and the crises of that scale that are on us now are to like have the ownership and therefore the right to choose what's done with like the fossil fuel industry, for example, to be put in the hands of more people who are more likely to them because it's in their interest to, and because they have a sense of a common future in which we're not affected by climate change, to repurpose the existing infrastructure to do positive things.
Yep. Go ahead. Yep.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to figure out, to your point about Airbnb, like what are the conditions that would make it easier for us to do that repurposing once the things become available, or not. I mean, maybe not fully available, but at least a little bit more available. And so that got me thinking about basically the open source community, which is doing a lot of that, right? Like if Airbnb had open source software, we would still not be able to immediately reproduce that entire community because it's a lot more than just software, but we have kind of the bones to start building on, which is a lot of what the open source community is doing. And then that led to another thought about licensing. And so one debate, this is tangentially interesting for this conversation, but I think there's a point there. There's one debate going on within the open source community, and that's whether licensing should be just saying what you can do with the product in terms of, like right now it basically says, well, if you use this open source license, you can use this software for whatever you want, or you can only use it for non-commercial purposes. Or for instance, in the case of free software, if you use it, you have to also make free everything you built on top of it, which unfortunately is not the most popular license because it basically means companies stop using it. But another conversation that's increasingly being held is like, can we make other kinds of requirements on the user of this software? And it's very much a debate, and I very much don't know which side I'm on, but other requirements could be things like you have to be cooperatively run, or you cannot have slave labor in any way, or you cannot use this to deport people, or and I'm wondering if it's a way for... No, one step back. The reason I'm not sure about it is because we're writing in some pretty, so I think occasionally quite random moral values into and attaching to something that may not have anything to do with that. So it's kind of, it feels a little wrong to me. But it may be a way to say, well, we're creating all these things as a commons. We're putting in our time and effort without ever getting paid, which is true for a lot of contributors to software development. Open source software, like should we get a say in how these things, how the things that are built on top of them, or even how the people who want to use these things should behave?
Yeah,
I mean, yeah, that's just...
I love that. I mean, I think that is an ethical membrane, right? Which is to say, we're not stopping you from using it, but we're asking, copyleft is a great example of this. We're, this was the spirit in which this was intended. You're free to use it in that spirit, but not free if you're going to use it in some other way. And I think it's interesting to embed some sort of like moral code into our use agreements, even if they seem irrelevant. Like imagine if everything that we did said, hey, you can only use this spoon if you are someone who cares about life in general. Like imagine that. Like it's like, I mean, it's hard to know what that would look like, but I think it's interesting. I don't see why we don't explore stuff like that.
I think we should explore it. I think there's an oppressive element to it, where those with the skills to build the software can all of a sudden, which is quite a scarce skill. Yeah, can decide the morals, which seems a little icky to me.
But yeah, that you currently do have these use agreements that we do on all the software we use, but all of the stuff we sign up for is let the capitalist system surveil and extract me.
Yeah.
Rather than I'm a good person and I agree to being a good person. Like turning the idea of consent
This reminds me of, I know I was just trying to wrap up, but just one last thing. This reminds me of a thought I had the other day, which was, if what we're doing in our sort of property or our access agreements between commons and other kinds of economic systems is sort of writing some agreement. If you come into the commons, we ask you that you can't use this for free if you're going to make money off it. But if you're using it to build things for other people or for their use value, you can use it for free. How do we build something similar for time? So if you're someone who operates in the commons, oftentimes you end up like buying back your time because it's really efficient. People are putting stuff together in groups, and so you end up sort of like when you operate in the commons, things tend to be sort of just cheaper, more freely available. You end up with more time on your hands, but oftentimes this time goes back into propping up a sort of other economic system. So you use it to go and like work overtime at your job so you can earn more money, or you use it to sort of so what would it look like to create ethical membranes or agreements about the surplus time generated by commoning versus capitalo time? I don't know what that is. So that's just something to think about for another day.
Kind of the opposite of a time bank, right? Like instead of time put in, it's like time you get receive, and then you can it's an earmarked number of hours that you can donate only to a certain
And I really like that concept too, and then just naming it so that you can time bank. You can be like I remember in Marinaleda, this small town in Spain where they had this sort of kind of wonderful experimental city, and they all pledge one Sunday a month, which I think they call Red Sunday, to put back into the city and repair things and paint the park benches and stuff. And so that's time that's like designated for the commons, which is really cool. Okay. Well, I am going to close this out. I'm going to close with this quote from David Bollier, which I think sums up a lot of what we said. In facing up to the many profound crises of our time, we face a conundrum that has no easy resolution. How are we to imagine and build a radically different system whilst living in the constraints of an incumbent system that aggressively resists transformational change? Our challenge is not just articulating attractive alternatives, but identifying credible strategies for actualizing them. Commoning refers to acts of mutual support, conflict negotiation, communication, and experimentation that are needed to create systems to manage shared resources. This process blends production or self-provisioning, governance, culture, personal interests, all into one integrated system. Commoners are focused on reclaiming their commonwealth in both the material and political sense. They want to roll back the pervasive privatization and marketization of their shared resources, from land to water to knowledge and urban spaces, and in Nook's case, data, and reassert greater participatory control over those resources and community life. Commoners wish to make certain resources inalienable, as Anouk said, protected from sale on the market and conserved for future generations. This project, to reverse market enclosures and reinvent the commons, seeks to achieve what state regulation has generally failed to achieve: effective social control of abusive, unsustainable market behavior. Okay. Well done, team. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week when we're going to talk about some other random socioeconomic strategy.
This is exciting. Yes, maybe UBIs. UBS.
Let's do UBIs and UBSs.
Yeah, that's more like the socialist agenda, I think. So
Great.
we're covering all of them. I like it.
That's beautiful. Yeah. That's beautiful.